Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. I hope that you're having a wonderful day. If you're new here, my name is Neve and I truly hope that you stick around. In today's video, we are going to be having a look at some of the theatre documentaries that I've been loving recently. I've been on a bit of a documentary kick, if I'm being honest, which is strange because until quite recently I wouldn't have considered myself a documentary fan at all. And for the most part, as per you'd expect for me, they've been theatre documentaries, with the exception of like a couple. So I'm going to tell you about the theatre ones, or the theatre adjacent ones today, which I'm very excited about because I've watched a couple over the last month or two and I'm quite excited to share with you guys what I thought. So let's get started. Okay, so I have my laptop here open to my letterboxd account. I decided that since I have been on a bit of kick of watching films and documentaries recently, that I would download Letterboxd and see what the fuss was about. I'm kind of having fun actually. I don't feel like I watch films consistently enough to deserve to be there, but sorry. But as well as my documentary kick, I've been on a bit of a rom-com kick at the minute, so I decided I would just download it and see what happened. If you'd like to follow me there and see what I'm watching, my username is @exiholic, the same as my Twitter. They wouldn't let me have Teenage Pipe Dream. I think it was too long. But we're just gonna use it. If you see me looking down, I'm just making sure I don't forget any of the documentaries that I wanted to mention in today's video. Okay, so the first one that I have down here is It Takes a Lunatic. Now, It Takes a Lunatic is sort of like a biography type documentary about a man called Win Handman, who is an acting coach in New York City and also was the creative director of the American Place Theatre whilst it was open. I really enjoyed this documentary. I do think I've written here, my only main criticism of this is I felt it was a little bit too long. I think it was something like 2 hours, 2.5 hours, which is a lot of time, I think, for not the, like, I feel like it was very interesting and we learned a lot about this man and the theatre he did and I found it fascinating, but I feel like documentaries of that length are usually better when they're talking about something that's like a meaty issue that you need the time to dissect. I feel like this documentary would have been equally as effective if it was like an hour and a half as opposed to 2.5 hours. But I'm not complaining that much. I didn't catch myself often being like, oh, like when is this going to be over? But I do think that I have quite a short attention span, and I definitely think when it got close to the end I was struggling slightly to continue to pay attention, so maybe it would have been better if it was slightly shorter. But I did find this documentary really interesting because this man's obviously a very good actor, or else he would not have been qualified to teach, and he's taught some of the biggest name actors that, like, every time someone came on screen to talk about him I was like, wow. But he isn't an actor, which I always find very interesting. It's nice to learn about the lives and professions of people in the industry who aren't necessarily actors, because I think sometimes we forget about them and we forget about the part that they play. So I definitely found it very interesting to learn about a slightly different side of the industry. I thought he was a very interesting man. I liked the anecdotes that were woven in about his life and the way that they've brought him to where he is, and I particularly enjoyed like not the second half, but like this section of the documentary that was really specifically about him running the American Place Theatre. I had heard of the theatre before, but I didn't know an awful lot about it. I didn't know that it was a not-for-profit. I didn't know quite some of the extremes that the theatre that he put on there went to, how new some of the stuff that he brought in was, and I just found it really interesting. I definitely feel like I learned a lot, and I could really understand when it was over why so many people were willing to sit and talk about this man on camera, basically. So I think if you're a theatre fan, I think this may be one you would need to be a theatre fan to really get the full enjoyment out of it. But if you are, I definitely recommend this one. I watched it on Netflix, so if you have Netflix, it should be there. Next up, which is, I feel doesn't really count as a theatre documentary, but it is about an actress, and it felt weird to leave her out because the other ones that are not theatre adjacent are like very much not theatre adjacent, and I felt I didn't want to leave this legend out. So this is Betty White, the First Lady of Television. I also watched this on Netflix, and I mean, I've written in my letterboxd review, I mean, who doesn't love Betty White? And I feel like that's basically what I've got to say now. It was a nice little documentary. Me and my mum watched it. We found it very funny. I think Betty White is hilarious. I think she's had such an interesting and impressive career. It was nice to learn about that from the people close to her, and at some points from her herself. I particularly enjoyed the scene near the end with her and the bear. Me and my mum were in stitches. It wasn't particularly meant to be funny, but the size difference between her and this like massive, I think it was a grizzly bear, was endlessly entertaining to us because she was talking to the bear like it was like a newborn puppy, which was absolutely hilarious. But I just find this really interesting. I know who Betty White is and I know what she's known for, but it was nice to get that in a little bit more detail as someone who's definitely not of the generation where you maybe would know that like by default. Obviously like Golden Girls isn't still running, things like that that had people interested in her are not necessarily topics of like modern day, not modern day, but you know what I mean. So it was really interesting to just learn a little more about someone who I admired and knew about and enjoyed watching, but necessarily didn't understand quite the breadth of the trajectory of her career, which was extremely impressive. And she's just brilliant, isn't she? She's Betty White. Next up we have 6 by Sondheim. He's just a legend, isn't he? I love hearing people in the theatre industry talk about their love for theatre and their jobs and the industry and the way they interact with it. I always find it very interesting. But Sondheim talks about his work and the public reception to his work with such earnest appreciation, and I found it so charming and so wonderful. His love for teaching, his respect for the role that teaching plays and the role that he has the opportunity to play as a teacher, I found so just lovely. He seems like such a humble, honest man, and I feel like that really came through in this documentary. But also like his little like sharp, witty snipes at people who have said nasty things about his work, and I just thought was really funny because like I think old people are really funny sometimes because I don't think they care quite the same way that someone like I do, and they just say things, and I think that honesty is so refreshing but sometimes so funny, and I definitely think that there was moments of that in here. But I mean, I know more about Sondheim, of course, than I knew about Betty White, but I didn't know a lot about him and his like how he discovered the theatre, what made him want to pursue the theatre, stuff like that. So it was really interesting as a semi-new musical theatre fan to get that information, and to get that information from Sondheim himself in those interviews. I just found really lovely. I thought this was a really good documentary, and I highly encourage you to have a watch that one as well if you're a theatre fan. I can't remember where I watched it, unfortunately, but if you can find it somewhere, I definitely think that it's a good one to check out and spend some of your evening or your day or whatever watching. Okay, next up is Black Hollywood, They've Gotta Have Us, which is a 3-part documentary series on Netflix. I found this documentary very insightful and definitely, admittedly, at times uncomfortable, which is absolutely the point and should be the case watching it as a white person. But I think I definitely understood the lengths to which black culture influenced pop culture in general to some extent. Like, I had an understanding of it, I knew that it was the case, but there were moments in this documentary that really drove that point home for me in a kind of shocking way. And also just learning about the history of Black cinema and the participation of Black actors and Black directors in cinema. It was really, I don't know the word to use, it was very, well, it was obviously very insightful, I definitely learned a lot, but there was a very apparent discomfort when watching it, when you realise that what they're classifying as history is all terrifyingly modern, and that was a very stark reminder of not even, I mean, to some extent how far we've come, but like, it took too long to start coming, and how far absolutely we still have to go. And I just gained this absolute, well, I mean, I don't want to say gained as if the respect wasn't there before, but the struggle and just disgusting behaviour that these actors and directors and writers and producers have to put up with in Hollywood, and as well particularly in Britain. It was just horrendous to sit and listen to and know that whether I like it or not, myself and every other white person in the world participate and let that continue to happen. And I think seeing, like, having an understanding of how that works just in the world in general is uncomfortable enough, but I think when you start looking into niche industries or niche social groups or whatever it is, and how that affects them directly, or how it works in that scenario directly, is always a little bit more intense, because you're no longer really dealing in generalized statements. It's a very like, this is the encounter in this instance, there's no way to hide from it, and it should be that way, and we should not be allowed or able to continue hiding from it. It's something that myself and other white people have to take responsibility for and start taking action to prevent from continuing. But yeah, it definitely showed me how much I had not acknowledged and how much I still have to learn, and has given me a definite extra fire under my arse to continue to educate myself. But yeah, I felt it was unfair to... I gave this a 5 out of 5 because I did very much enjoy it. Other than, like, there were some little editing things that I wasn't a fan of, but in the grand scheme of things, I thought it was brilliant. But I don't think I can give it a 5 out of 5 for the actual information in it, because I don't know. I was learning things, I didn't know most of the information they were giving me, so I definitely don't think it's my place to pass judgment on that aspect of it. But I definitely enjoyed it. It definitely had a massive impact on me, and I think that that's one of the main things you hope for with any piece of art or cinema or anything, is for it to have an impact, and it definitely did have an impact. The next documentary that I watched was the best worst thing that could have happened. No, wait. Was best worst thing that ever could have happened, which is quite a mouthful. This documentary is about the original Broadway production of Stephen Sondheim's Merrily We Roll Along, one of the most famous flops in Broadway history. It ended Stephen Sondheim and Hal Prince's Broadway collaborations for years. And it was kind of following some of the original cast as they encountered their experience with getting the role in the show, the rehearsal process, finding out the show was closing, where they are now. It had an interesting, like, parallel run to the idea of what Merrily is. I just found it really interesting. I didn't know a massive amount about Merrily We Roll Along. It is one of many Sondheim shows that I've yet to get round to interacting with in any great detail, but I really enjoyed it. It was nice to hear from the people. I just love a bit of theatre history, and I think I knew about Merrily, and I knew about the flop that Merrily had been. So it was interesting to hear it coming from the source again. And I'm glad that it has lived on past that flop, because there are many shows that don't get that opportunity, and I think for the cast recording to be so well loved, and it's been done so many times everywhere in the world after that point, it's really nice to see something that so many people put all of their heart into get the love back that I feel like it deserves. But yeah, the next documentary I watched was Every Little Step, which follows the casting process of the 2006 revival of A Chorus Line. I can't remember if it was 2006. It's 2006 or 2007, something like that. The Broadway revival of A Chorus Line. It follows like the audition process of that. I just thought it was really interesting. It was a nice way to spend an evening. I found particularly interesting, if you've seen this documentary before, there is a man who auditions for one of the roles called Jason Tam, and he was brilliant in the documentary. There was like a bit of a moment for him that I found really interesting, but what I found particularly interesting is the role that he auditions for in this is very different from the role that I had known him as out with that, which is playing the squip and Be More Chill. So it was nice to see him do this very human, emotional part, which is very much in contrast to the sort of supercomputer super villain that I know him as. So I found that really interesting, and there's a couple of other faces that I recognised and was like googling whilst I was watching it to see what I'd recognised them doing, and for most of those things that I did recognise them for happened after A Chorus Line because of the opportunity that A Chorus Line gave them, which is always very interesting. And it was nice to learn a little bit more about the history of the show and what it meant to some of the people involved in the revival who had been involved in the original production. So it was nice. I like a bit of reminiscing. You'll learn very quickly about me. I like a little bit of reminiscing. There's nothing wrong with a healthy dose of nostalgia, I don't think. Anyway, next up is Bathtubs over Broadway. This is possibly the most random documentary I think ever. Like, not so much, I'm not surprised it got made. It makes a lot of sense to me that it exists, but the fact that the subject matter exists is very interesting to me. Bathtubs over Broadway is about the sort of phenomenon through the 60s to the 90s of large corporations putting on musicals for their staff at the big sales summits. Basically what they would do is, back in sort of 60s, 70s, 80s America, most people who had a job working for a company had that job their whole lives, and they would sell things. And to continue to motivate them and to push them to sell more things and be this great all-American company, a lot of organisations used to hold like massive like meets for like weekends in these big resorts where they would get pretty much every member of staff in the country to this one place, and they would like teach them how to improve their skills and motivate them and like show this appreciation. And one of the ways that they used to do this was to put on these like massive industrial musicals that they would pay like legitimate musical theatre composers to write and compose, and then they would hire actors and whatnot and they would put them on, and they had like massive budgets, but they were completely non-commercial. Like, the only people who were allowed to see them were the people who worked for this company that were there that night. They weren't, the cast recordings weren't sold, although they existed, the DVD wasn't broadcasted, things like that, and there was just hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of them. And it follows this guy who randomly stumbled across one and then sort of dedicated himself to collecting as many of them as possible and meeting as many of the people involved with them as possible. And there were some like big names in this documentary. Cheetah Rivera shows up, Martin Short is there. He mentions one of the industrial musicals being written by the people who wrote Fiddler on the Roof. It was all just so strange and so incredibly interesting, and it made me quite uncomfortable how much I enjoyed it, because it was like basically just capitalist on speed. It was capitalism on speed. It was like paying all this money to convince people that we just had to continue churning shit out and making people buy it. But it had such a weirdly profound impact on both the performers involved and the like everyday salespeople who were getting to watch it, that I couldn't help feeling a little bit heartwarmed. And I just thought it was really interesting, and it was a nice way to spend an hour and a half. It wasn't very stressful, it wasn't like a heavy topic, it was just like this really random theatre niche, and I had a lot of fun actually, so it's a win for me. Next up, and I think last, but don't hold me to it, is the Boys in the Band Something Personal, which is the little documentary that came out alongside the new film adaptation of Mark Crowley's The Boys in the Band. Now, if you've watched some of my other videos, or I think my March reading roundup, I mentioned that I love this film, and I do love this film. When I watched the film the first time, I watched the documentary. I've also watched the little documentary 2 or 3 times out with that. One for a school project, and again recently just because I felt like it. I really like this documentary. I think Mark Crowley is so charming and so humble, and he really looks like he's lived a life and come out better for it. He had so many really interesting things to say. A lot of this play was informed very specifically about his life and the people that he loved, and it was really interesting to see him get to talk about these people and talk about his life and the decision that he made to write it and the impact that writing it has had on his life, and then also just some of the like daft things that they did with the actors that were just, it was just nice to see this sort of very ensemble teamwork piece be translated into this like 25-minute documentary that you both learn a lot about the piece, but also sort of just got to see these actors and their process and their relationship with Mark Crowley, but also with their characters. I just had a lot of fun. It was nice. Just a nice week, 20 extra minutes to be in this universe of this play that I really like. So yeah, that is all of the theatre documentaries that I have watched and for the most part loved recently. I just love a good theatre documentary. That's about it. My mum, perhaps not so much, because after I watch them she has to listen to me tell her about them. She's not got a massive interest in theatre, so poor her. But yeah, I hope that you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please feel free to leave a like, or even better, subscribe. I would love to have you here, and I'll see you next week. Bye!